All right. So jumping into the demo here, I'm going to introduce our member in this case. This is Rachel Adams. Quick harbor tour on our home screen. And what you're looking at is kind of our rendition of what USAA's member portal could look like on Experience Cloud. So in the middle here, we've got some flex cards. Robert will talk about that in just a second on some policies we already have. Again, keep in mind, everything on here is component based. So when I say that, here's our policy, kind of component or card we dropped on here. The trending articles component. These are out of the box things that we can just drop on the page. Same thing with some of the self-service capabilities that we have on the right-hand side. And then our simple navigation bar on top. So I'm going to go into our homeowners comparative in just a second, but to quick call out on the policies here, if this is Salesforce information, again, incredibly easy for us to just drop it on the screen, but realizing that, you might have to connect to a different policy admin or other information that isn't stored on Salesforce for these flex cards to basically show that information. Robert, anything to kind of call out here? I think two main pieces that we're going to talk about in terms of either showing data or moving data around are going to be the flex cards, which really is what this is right here. And then the Omniscript, which is kind of that workflow similar to the claims file loss on the farmer side you just saw.
Yeah, and then another thing that I'll cover are integration procedures. And so as the name implies, they're the way that we can go and get data from other sources outside of Salesforce and display it all through one UI. So a lot of systems kind of prefer that data comes natively from that system and they can accommodate, other outside data through APIs, but it's never really the same. With Omni Studio, the use of flex cards and Omniscripts here, all of that data can really be treated the same because whether the data comes from Salesforce or API, ultimately it's all being converted into JSON that is being used to feed all of this. So it doesn't matter where it's coming from.
I think this is a good point to point out that this addresses that challenge that Stephanie was mentioning about that data of specific that she's mentioned us about specific agency policies and displaying up-to-date information from those agency policies, as well as the types of information about those policies. Because that's already within Salesforce, the ability to easily display that here for members. So this is where we're kind of addressing that business need that definitely Stephanie and Leslie brought to our attention when we started having these conversations.
So I think I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a transparency and my healthy skepticism there, right? So, coming at it from my architect's point of view, if the data is in the core of the FSC instance that you're using, right? I mean, from my perspective, it should be trivial for us to access it via API, right? So just know that I'm going to probe on that point that you just made, Gene. Right. And I really want to understand, what is the perceived, challenge there. Because again, we can go after and call an API off of our platforms just as easily as you can get that data, right? Or at least that's what I'm being told, by kind of Brian and the rest of the Salesforce team. So just we can put a pin in that, but that's something I definitely want to make sure that I understand, from your perspective, what's there in Experience Cloud that really makes a difference.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that so that we can address that more with a little more in depth of the architecture discussion.
Awesome. All right, so let's get into kind of the meat and potatoes of why Rachel would have logged in here and really why we're meeting today as a group. So I'm going to go into our new quote request for a comparative rate on a new homeowners policy. And this is going to pull up one of those Omniscripts that we had mentioned. So if we have, a property, maybe it's in Florida, for example, that we really need to pull in and start getting a quote on, we can start pre-filling some of this information because we do have her logged in. We know some information on this already, and start walking through essentially this workflow for a new quote request here. Robert, I can keep clicking through if there's anything that you want to kind of pepper in as we add in on really the value or why we would use an Omniscript in this case.
Yep. So in this case, this data this is demo data that's pre-filled in here because in this case we're calling the Vertafore comparator, and this is what they require for their application. But in terms of populating these fields, this could come from anything that we already know about the account, including past policies, properties, insured items, things like that. So, which is a big reason to look at Omniscript here as a way to do that, because you can, query the Salesforce data, pre-populate these fields, and then in the back end we can turn it into a payload that goes to an API. So here, like this step for coverage details for home, this is allowing you to select something other than the default levels of coverage. But for homeowners, well, there's only two things that can really affect that: the property value and personal liability limit, because everything else is driven off of that. That's why you see those two values at the top. But if you're looking at other lines as well, like an auto, there could be other defaults that you might want to pick here. So go to the next. A lot of these comparator APIs are conversational. So as we're going through the Omniscript, there can be API calls happening behind the scenes that are sending the data that we've already collected and then determining what we do next. And yes, this one, I'm going to run through this from the admin view. So we'll, like an agent talking to someone over the phone and running the comparator for them. So we'll see quotes come back in real time and see what that looks like.
Awesome. So that's one example of basically if we've got to take that comparative API and basically embed this in the site with that Omniscript. Another quick example, if it is going to be basically quote rating and binding on platform, we can do that as well. So just another example here for that homeowners policy. If it is going to be something that we don't need to go and punch out with the API and do a comparative rate to, we can simply do that here as well. Other things that we see in here quite a bit as I start autofilling a lot of these, contents on things that we might already know about, or adding these in as I'm, kind of Rachel, the member, walking through this, adding in any art or, other personal effects. Once we get to the end here, we can embed, an eSignature via DocuSign, have the policy note or the quote, whatever it is, kind of come up and do that all right within the platform here as well, instead of having to kick that out or use another send it off in an API. That can be embedded right within the Omniscript and effectively fill out the form, the sheet, terms and conditions, the quote, the policy, whatever that is, right within kind of the workflow here. I don't know if I need to finish this one up here for the sake of time. Make sure I get Robert enough time at the end here. So those are kind of two of the quote requests that we went through there. Any questions on that? Otherwise, I'm going to dive into one of the policies here, kind of take a look at that, a couple of other, Experience Cloud functionality pieces, and then kick it over to Robert for kind of our last bit.
Sounds good to me.
All right. So I had clicked on that flex card outlining the auto policy on the home page here. And I'm just going to kind of keep talking about aspects of self-service that come into this. A lot of times when I think of self-service on Salesforce, it's like, hey, there's a knowledge article, there's a case I'm creating, and that's what's going to fix my issue there. When I think about self-service in financial services, it's usually around, it's money movement, it's managing something on that policy or on that, product that they own from you. So in this case, some of that self-service is going to be around creating a claim. We saw this a little bit already on the farmer side, so I'm not going to go through the entire process here, but all of these aspects of, what are those digital touch points that we have with the members? How are those being managed? And can we simplify that in, a common way on Salesforce and say, hey, we already know about this policy. We know what vehicles that this household has. Let's kind of move through this. We know either Rachel was driving, maybe her husband was driving instead. What kind of an incident happened here? It was a collision. All of the kind of normal first notice of loss things that we would need are going to kind of walk through here. We can see what stage that we're in as we kind of walk through all of the aspects of this to get this created and essentially get that first notice of loss for a claim submitted. And then the underlying workflow can have follow-ups and emails go out to internal folks, external folks, whoever we need to contact, the right tasks going out at the right time. If certain things sit in a certain status for a certain number of days or, whatever those kind of SLAs look like, all of those things can now start to be automated. And it was all kicked off via what Rachel did right here. Similarly, when it's maybe not as, dire of need as, hey, I just had an accident, but I might need to add or remove a driver from a policy. Similar workflow here. Some of our selections are going to be a little bit different, obviously, but we can do, same type of thing and then have that kind of be processed on the back end as well. Last couple things I'm going to call out are not really specific to insurance or even financial services at all, but I think are kind of just important to note here as well. So we've all kind of seen chatbots out there. This could be a phone call, web chat, a live agent. It could be a chat bot. Anything that we might want to take. Hey, can we eliminate phone calls in any way for simple requests that might be out here? Or maybe it's guidance to say, you know what, you can actually add that driver to your policy, right here by clicking this, and the chatbot can mention that instead of saving a phone call coming in. Last thing I'll call out here is going to be just global search. So I'll do something like a password reset just to pull this up. Search results are going to be completely configurable for you here as well. So if there's going to be a knowledge article out there, if there's a case that you already have open about this, maybe it's going to be already closed, maybe a service agent already kind of responded to that. Any type of data that you want to kind of sort here on the left-hand side can be done on that as well. And global search, I think, is one of the things that is just, out of the box. I don't have to configure it, so I don't talk about it too much in a demo, but certainly is one of those aspects that's used a lot by our members, our customers, and our users on Experience Cloud. So quick time check. We got about 25 minutes left. I'm going to go into the builder and kind of show how this is made here really briefly, and then kick it over to Robert. But any questions on that before I leave kind of this demo environment that we're looking at here?
None for me. Thank you.
All right. So here's the builder that we basically used to design all this. Now, just a quick kind of disclaimer. My background, I was an econ grad from college, and then I spent 4 years as a banker at JP Morgan. So my background in software engineering, web dev, and just UI design is very limited. But the components that we have here and the layouts that we use, for example, something like just a simple section here, we've got 2-section column with, kind of this column distribution is how most of this site page is laid out. Each of the site pages in this sitemap, we were just on some of them as we kind of walk through this, are going to be laid out here so we can add new pages easily, and then add them to the navigation, add them to hyperlinks, buttons, things like that. Other aspects on this screen that you'll see as I'm kind of moving around, things like this flex card component came from our component list, which is here. This is that, 100 out-of-the-box components that we have to pull things onto the page, anything from, the workflow to links to buttons to record banners. I'll kind of hover over a couple of these other ones here as well that were just really grabbed from this component bar, dragged onto the page, even something like a CMS collection where we might have some articles and blogs, images, just taking it from that component panel and dropping it on the screen here. Other aspects on this that we get questions on a lot is, well, how do I make it look and feel like mine? I work with some of the other banks that don't have blue as their color. That comes in on the themes over here. So you can upload your own color palette, add your own color palette here. You can add your own CSS and branding sets as well if you really want to take it to the next level. Other things on here that are going to be pretty easy, like this USAA logo. It's kind of hard to see here because it's white, but that's the logo that's behind the component bar right here. So we've uploaded the logo, the theme, the color palette, and almost everything else here from a design aspect is going to start inheriting those colors. Even custom elements that we're building out are going to reference the theme colors here so that if I add a button on the page, well, let's use the USAA blue for that button color right away, and I don't have to set that after the fact. So that's a crash course really quickly in how this is built. We would typically publish this. I can also preview and move over into a mobile or tablet view as well. Like I mentioned, everything is going to be mobile friendly out of the box. So things are going to cascade vertically now instead of horizontally. All of those components on the screens and the layout kind of merge into that phone friendly approach. My navigation bar turns into this top left corner, and I can see things right here as well. All right.
So I have to ask you this because I'm genuinely an application development nerd. So all of that's great. I've seen kind of various flavors of that over the years. What do you actually package it into? Do you package it into, something like an underlying React JavaScript application, or what does that end up translating to in terms of runtime deployment?
Yeah, so Salesforce, the runtime on here is, you know, our Lightning runtime basically. It's not an Angular or React, you know, kind of base. The components on here, if you do need to build your own custom Lightning Web components, are going to be, you know, Java, HTML, and CSS based. As a wrapper for those components can be dropped on the page. As far as deployment goes, then, if that's kind of where you're going with this here a little bit, we do support, you know, full regular, you know, CI/CD type process where if this is being built in a sandbox and then sent to UAT, we can kind of take a look at, instead of the declarative pieces on here, packaging up the code in a repo and then deploying that from a code perspective, instead of just simply saying, hey, yeah, drag pieces around on the page, hit publish, and then it goes live right away. None of our customers do that. That's how we do it in a demo environment. But that, you know, normal software development lifecycle and CI/CD process from a code perspective is still supported here.
Gotcha. And I think the key there was that it basically is deployed into your Lightning environments and technology. So I appreciate that.
Yep, correct. All right, we've got about 20 minutes here. Any other questions here on either the builder or the demo piece that I had shown? Otherwise, I'm going to kick it over to Robert for his piece. Awesome.
All right. Great. Thanks, Harrison. Let me navigate the share window here and check this out. So what I'll do is walk you through a couple of examples here. That the first thing I'm going to do is walk you through an example of getting comparative quotes, in this case from Vertafore, but it could also be from Bolt or other comparative raters, just so you see what that process looks like. And then when the quotes come back, what can either the agent or the self-service user see? So right now we don't have flex cards built to show the comparative quotes in self-service. That's why I'm going to show it to you from like a call center internal agent perspective. So let me go to my account view here. So I'm on the 360 page for Rachel Adams. So we can say that maybe Rachel called in and is interested in comparative homeowners quotes, and I'm the one handling the call, and I have appropriate authority and to be able to run the comparative quotes to her. So while I'm talking to Rachel, I can come down and kick off the process to run some comparative quotes. In this case, I'm using our Vertafore or integration with Vertafore. And so when I click that link, that launches me into an Omniscript. So that Omniscript is the way that we walk a user through a process. So you see the steps on the right. And I'll show you the designer quickly in a little bit. The net of it is this is a drag and drop designer. And what this essentially becomes at runtime is a Lightning Web Component. So you probably know about web components in general. So Salesforce has its Lightning flavor of web components. The fields are all pre-populated here with what will work in the demo environment that we have hooked up with Vertafore here. So I'll just click through. I'd say don't pay too much attention to what is being asked here, because each comparator will have their own set of questions. Now, on one hand, homeowners is all going to kind of be the same, but like Bolt is a little different here because I know you already use Bolt. So you probably know how Bolt will go out and do some of its own pre-fill. So in the case of Bolt, there would be fewer questions that need to be looked at here because they're doing some of that integration on the back end. But here, with these fields that need to be passed to Vertafore, these could all be pre-filled with anything that we already know about the account. And so those first few screens are just getting that application data in. And then this I mentioned before is if you, down below you see the default coverages that will be submitted to the carriers. And so if you wanted to change that up front as opposed to resubmitting and getting another set of quotes, you could do that from a screen like this. And then from here is where the conversation starts happening in the background with the API. So we take that application data together. We can transform the data into other data formats. So from one flavor of JSON into another, or JSON to XML and vice versa. And so with that, we've already made some initial calls to Vertafore to create the application and tell Vertafore to submit that application to the carriers for HO3 quotes. And then what we'll do next is we will get routed to a new opportunity that'll be created, and the quotes that have come back will be put under that new opportunity for us. So if I do not. Oh, I'm sorry. One other step here. So yeah, one other step with the Vertafore API is that they give you a response back of any fields that they've defaulted or verified. So as the agent entering this data, I didn't enter data for is something protected suburban. There was another type where we had to indicate a bill type, or if they want paperless billing. These things can be left blank and they'll be defaulted by Vertafore. So it's just letting me know what values are being put in these fields, so it's not a surprise to me later. And we're taking that response from the API and bubbling it up to the UI as an example of how you can take information from that API and make it presented to the user, which could also include declinations from certain carriers if you're expecting to see something from a carrier. So now we know we're getting quotes back from these 3 carriers. There's a test company that Vertafore has, and then also Stillwater and Farmers. So now I'm going to get navigated to that opportunity. So here's my new opportunity. This was just created behind the scenes by an integration procedure that I'll talk about in a minute. That's that microservice part of the Omni Studio architecture. And we've got our 3 quotes here on the opportunity. So the opportunity is what we use to manage the overall sales opportunity with Rachel. And it's got these status indicators so that we can march it through the process. So anyone running a report on this can know where this opportunity is in the pipeline. And clicking on any one of these chevrons can also trigger any automatic workflows. So maybe I need to, if I move it to proposal quote, maybe if that needs to generate a task for someone else to look at, that could all happen automatically. Or even reassign this opportunity to a queue for some other team to pick up, or assign it to an individual automatic assignment. That can all happen through things like clicking on these different statuses, because then we can capture that event and then run some of those business rules that we talked about in the background.
Hey, quick question on your terminology. So
Yep.
in terms of the way you use the word opportunity, is it specifically a relationship between a specific person and a specific product, or is it more general and broad than that?
It could be more broad than that. There's not a strict definition of what the scope of the opportunity has to be. So yeah, I mean, this could be Rachel's looking for umbrella insurance, homeowners, and auto.
Gotcha.
And we can bring back,
okay, well, that's a great example, right? So in that case, you've got one opportunity, but you've got a possibility of selling multiple product lines.
Right.
Okay.
And it's really about and it's really about how you want to run this internally, because you may say, well, maybe you want one type of opportunity for anything that you write in-house, but a different type of opportunity that anything goes through agency. It all depends on how you need to divide it up internally. So let's look at these quotes here. So we have 3 quotes that have come back. We see their price, but I want to drill into some of the details on them. So maybe I'll go into the test company first here. So I drill into a quote, and in the quote, I see some coverages for that quote. So I can see the coverage limits here. And in this case, we're getting prices back at the coverage limit level. And so this is just one quote. They say, okay, I want to be able to quickly do a compare of these different quotes that have come back so that I can see the differences between them. So I'll go to my version history, because these are 3 different versions of quotes on that opportunity. And I want to compare the versions. So now I expand that, and I can see it might be a little hard to see on Zoom, but wherever there's this little asterisk, there's a difference somewhere in here. So like in here, we see the dwelling limit is the same, but there's a difference on the pricing of that coverage for the dwelling unit. And then we can start to see maybe how that explains why some of the total premiums, the annual premiums, are different. So as an agent, I can walk through that with the customer and decide which quote I want to go with. On the quote, if you needed to take notes, there's lightning notes. So Jonathan, back to a question you had earlier, these are examples of, these are like core Salesforce Financial Services Cloud features that are being included in the quoting capability here. So that's a rich text note. You can take multiple notes. You can also have files. There's the file management system in Salesforce. So if there are files we needed to upload here, we could do that. So that's a way that you can manage one quote. Now, when it comes time to bind it, if the carrier has the APIs to bind, and especially because in the case of Bolt is really trying to push the carriers to expose these APIs to Bolt, so Bolt can then front end those APIs. So if the carrier has those APIs, then you could call those Bolt APIs to drive that entire quote to bind process right from here within Salesforce. So within the Salesforce UI, it's just more API calls that are happening to get there, right?
Well, and that brings up a kind of questions in the back of my mind, right? Is you're using the word quote and you mean the word quote, right? Because I think, right, as opposed to an estimate. So we're not looking at an estimation process. We're looking at a quoting process, which could then be moved to binding.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Which is a perfect segue to the scenario where if the carrier does not have APIs, then then from there you have to follow the traditional workflow, which is the agent has to punch out to that carrier site. In order to do that, we can construct a URL. This one's static, but you can have a field be a URL that we could put query string parameters like the quote ID, and if there's like a producer appointment ID or whatever else needs to be put on there, so that they could punch out to the carrier site to complete the quote from there. And so that's an example of running through some of these quotes from an internal agent perspective. And I'm going to flip over to show you a couple of slides here. Now, in terms of how this could be displayed in self-service, go to slideshow view here. This is a mock-up, but it's just, whoops, was a mock-up, there we go. Yeah, this is a mock-up, just showing an example of, like in one case, what a designer put together as one way that you might think about how quotes are shown in self-service, because maybe you want to show the different quotes that come back and let the user do their own compare between them and maybe pick one that they're interested in, and then that triggers a task for an agent to follow up that user. What you want that visual to be in the workflow to be is really up to you at that point. But we're bringing the quotes back, and then you can display them and define that workflow for that self-service user the way that you want to from there. And then while we're on this page or on these slides, this is a slide I put together a while back to explain our integration with Bolt, and the one with Vertafore works very similar. So with our 3 swim lanes here at the top, we have the Omniscript, which I showed you, which is the thing that I walked through to fill out the application data. Now, in between the Omniscript and the Bolt APIs are the integration procedures, which are the things that we use to create those server-side processes to do things like data transformation, calling APIs, getting data from Salesforce and other systems. And so those integration procedures are what actually call the Bolt APIs down at the bottom. So how does this integration work? Well, if you go to the Bolt API documentation, you can see the APIs that we need to call. So those are what we're calling from the integration procedures. And the integration procedures are basically doing the data transformation back and forth between the front end of the Omniscript and what the payload is expected by Bolt.
And this is a good example of, I think I'm interested in a click down in terms of like where these capabilities live, in terms of the product stack, and then how they would be, and where we would consider them sitting in terms of the architecture stack as well, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Right. If you're familiar with like a traditional layered architecture kind of mental model, right? Do they sit at the UI layer? Do they sit at the UI enablement layer? Do they sit at the workflow or API layer? Things like that. We don't have to answer those questions today. I think that looking at the time, that's probably a click down for another day, but I just wanted to get that idea out there.
Okay. Yeah, and actually I can give you a little preview of that with what I was going to wrap up with here, which is a little look behind the scenes of, okay, we talk about doing all this through configuration, because everything that you saw with Vertafore and everything we've done with Bolt, it was done without writing any code. So while there is the ability to code in Apex and Salesforce, with the Omni Studio tools, we haven't needed to do that. And that's because the declarative tools like Omniscript, Flex Cards, integration procedures are all powerful. Basically powerful enough to be able to do these complicated integrations without having to go to code. So like here's an example of the Omniscript for the Vertafore quote. And so an Omniscript, it's more of a human-guided workflow. So there are visual components to it, right? Like here's one of the steps that we remember seeing when I was going through that application. But there can be processing that happens in between these visual steps. Like here's another step that you could walk through visually, but there's something that happens in between there. So this is a way that we can coordinate as the user walking through something, what kind of automation is happening in the background. And in terms of how this is built, as you can see, it's a graphical designer, so WYSIWYG designer, so I can drag and drop fields onto the page here in order to define what the UI is, and then we have other actions that can be dropped in to define what happens in between these steps. And so, yeah, this is more of the UI layer, and you can have some logic running here, but what I've done for a lot of these integrations is to use the integration procedure, which is a server-side process, which let's get to that here. So the integration procedure, if we think of the stack, now we're on the server side. It's not, it's kind of like the 3-tier architecture, right? So we've got the UI, we've got server processes, and then we've got the data. So this is like the server process that's running. So the Omniscript tells the integration procedure, hey, here's a payload coming in. So the Omniscript gives the integration procedure, in this case, this payload, and then the integration procedure is going to run these steps. So these steps are different action types that come from the palette on the left here. So I've got we're going to get some information about Vertafore. We're looking up the bearer token information. We're doing some transform here. We're making an actual call to Vertafore, and then probably doing some transformation on the data that comes back. And I mentioned how this is kind of like a microservice in a way, and that it's versionable. So I can create versions. This is version 3. I can unit test this individual. It's essentially like a class or a service, right? So I can do execute here. I can unit test this one thing. So I see the response that comes back. I can step through the individual steps here. And then I can also export this and move it into another Salesforce org. So I can move it from my dev to QA to production as a whole unit here. So the integration procedure is something that, as the name implies, it is used for integration that we can call out to APIs for it. This is also a way that we can expose services in Salesforce. So Jonathan, you were asking earlier about being able to create APIs in Salesforce. So an integration procedure can be used to where my requests coming in, so like if I were to go into Postman, I could create a request coming in of this data, and then these steps would run, and then the response on the HTTP response would be my response payload here, which I just collapsed. So it's worked for both calling out, being our own internal service, and it's also essentially the service provider in Salesforce for exposing data without having to write code. So I think that gives you, in interest of time, just a little bit of an idea of how we perform some of these actions here and the declarative tools that part of Salesforce, but ultimately also part of Experience Cloud, because an Omniscript can be run in Experience Cloud, like you saw Addison do earlier, and then Omniscript can call integration procedures and things like that along the way. So it's all part of what comes along for the ride with Experience Cloud. And so with that, when I stop sharing and turn it back to